scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom. But something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows that moved independently of the clouds outside. As she walked downstairs for breakfast, she noticed that all the family photos on the wall had changed. In every picture, the smiles were just a little too wide, the eyes a little too bright, and everyone was looking directly at her. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen making breakfast, but when she turned around, her face was exactly the same as always, yet somehow completely wrong. Her orange dress was the right color, her smile was in the right place, but there was something hollow behind her eyes, like looking into an empty house through lit windows. Daddy Pig sat at the table reading his newspaper, but the pages were blank. When Peppa pointed this out, he just laughed his usual laugh and said everything was perfectly normal. George was playing with his dinosaur toy, but the toy seemed to be moving on its own, walking across the table in small, jerky steps when no one was touching it. The family decided to visit Grandpa and Grandma Pig, but when they arrived at the familiar house, it looked exactly the same from the outside while being completely different inside. The rooms were in the wrong places, the stairs led to rooms that shouldn't exist, and there were doors that opened onto walls. Grandpa Pig was in his garden, but he was planting flowers that were already fully grown, and when he pulled them from the soil, they had no roots at all. Grandma Pig invited everyone for tea, but the teacups were empty even though she poured steaming liquid into them. The biscuits on the plate kept multiplying when no one was looking, and the clock on the wall was running backwards. When Peppa mentioned these strange things, everyone just smiled and nodded as if everything was perfectly normal. As the day continued, more friends arrived for a playdate. Susie Sheep came over, but she kept forgetting things she had just said, repeating the same sentences over and over. Pedro Pony arrived, but he cast no shadow despite the bright sunlight. Rebecca Rabbit brought her little brother Richard, but Richard never blinked, not even once, and his eyes followed everyone around the room. The children decided to play hide and seek in the house, but every time someone hid, they would disappear completely until the game was over. When it was Peppa's turn to hide, she found a room she had never seen before, filled with toys that looked exactly like all her friends. But the toys were moving and playing by themselves, having conversations in voices that sounded almost right but not quite. As evening approached, the family gathered for dinner, but the food on their plates kept changing when they weren't looking. Peppa would take a bite of carrots, but when she looked down, she was eating something else entirely. The dining room windows showed a view of the garden, but the garden outside was different each time she looked, sometimes showing places she had never been before. When bedtime came, Peppa climbed the stairs to her room, but there were more steps than there should have been. Her bedroom door was the same pink color as always, but when she opened it, the room was much larger than before, stretching back into shadows that seemed to go on forever. Her bed was in the right place, but there were other beds too, identical to hers, lined up in rows disappearing into the darkness. As Peppa lay down to sleep, she could hear voices coming from the other beds, all sounding exactly like her own voice, having conversations she wasn't part of. The voices talked about days she didn't remember living and friends she had never met. Outside her window, the moon was the wrong shape, and the stars were arranged in patterns that spelled out words she couldn't quite read. Just before she fell asleep, Peppa realized that tomorrow would be exactly the same as today, and the day after that would be the same as well. Everything would be perfectly normal and completely wrong, and no one would notice except her. The voices from the other beds grew quieter as she drifted off, but they never stopped completely, whispering stories of all the other Peppas who had discovered this place before her, and all the ones who would come after. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa and George were playing in their bedroom. The toys scattered across the floor seemed perfectly normal, but something felt different tonight. The shadows in the corners appeared darker than usual, and the familiar sounds of the house had fallen into an unsettling silence. Peppa noticed that her favorite teddy bear was sitting in a strange position, its button eyes seeming to follow her movements. When she blinked, the bear appeared to have moved slightly closer to the edge of the bed. George, clutching his dinosaur toy, whispered that he heard strange scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. As the night grew deeper, the children's room began to transform. The cheerful wallpaper started to peel at the edges, revealing something dark and twisted underneath. The colorful drawings on the walls began to change, their innocent smiles turning into sinister grins with too many teeth. Mummy Pig called from downstairs, but her voice sounded hollow and distant, as if it was coming from somewhere far away. When Peppa tried to respond, no sound came from her mouth. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock that wasn't there before. The toys around them started to move on their own. Blocks rearranged themselves into disturbing patterns, and the rocking horse began to rock back and forth without anyone touching it. George's dinosaur toy let out a low, unnatural growl that made both children freeze in terror. Suddenly, the bedroom door creaked open, but nobody was there. A cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the night light and plunging everything into darkness. In the blackness, they could hear footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, getting closer with each passing second. When the lights flickered back on, the room had completely changed. The walls were now covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse with their own dark energy. The mirror on the dresser showed not their reflection, but something else entirely: shadowy figures with glowing eyes watching them from the other side. Peppa reached for George's hand, but when she looked at him, his familiar face had changed. His eyes had become completely black, and when he smiled, rows of sharp teeth gleamed in the dim light. He spoke in a voice that wasn't his own, asking if she wanted to play a new game that would last forever. The house itself seemed to be alive now, breathing and shifting around them. The floorboards creaked and groaned as if something massive was moving beneath them. The windows showed not the familiar garden outside, but an endless void filled with swirling darkness and distant, haunting whispers. As Peppa tried to run toward the door, she realized that the hallway beyond had stretched impossibly long, with doors leading to rooms that shouldn't exist. Each door she passed whispered her name, inviting her to come inside and never leave. The familiar yellow house had become a maze of nightmares, and there was no way out.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, and the familiar sounds of her family moving around downstairs were strangely absent. She called out for Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, but only silence answered back. Peppa made her way downstairs, her little hooves clicking against the wooden steps in a rhythm that seemed to echo longer than it should. The living room was exactly as she remembered it. The purple sofa, the yellow walls, the television in the corner, but everything felt hollow, like a stage set waiting for actors who would never come. She found George in the garden, standing perfectly still by the muddy puddles they loved to jump in. But when Peppa approached him, she noticed something peculiar. George wasn't blinking. His eyes were fixed on something she couldn't see, and when she waved her hand in front of his face, he didn't react at all. The other children from playgroup began arriving one by one, but they all shared the same strange behavior. Susie Sheep stood motionless by the gate, Pedro Pony remained frozen near the swing set, and Candy Cat sat unnaturally still on the garden bench. They all had the same vacant stare, looking at something beyond Peppa's vision. As the day progressed, Peppa realized she was the only one who could move freely. Everyone else had become like living statues, their eyes following something invisible that drifted through the air around them. The silence was broken only by a soft humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When evening came, the humming grew louder, and Peppa finally saw what everyone else had been watching. Shadows began to dance on the walls, taking shapes that didn't match anything in the room. The shadows moved independently, reaching out with long, thin fingers toward each frozen figure. One by one, her friends and family began to change. Their usual bright colors started to fade, becoming pale and translucent. George was the first to become completely see-through, like a ghost of his former self. Then Susie, then Pedro, until Peppa found herself surrounded by transparent versions of everyone she loved. The shadow figures grew bolder, stepping away from the walls entirely. They had no faces, just smooth darkness where features should be. but Peppa could feel them watching her with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. They moved with purpose, circling around her like they were deciding what to do next. Peppa tried to run, but found that her own movements were becoming slower and more difficult. Looking down at her hands, she saw that she too was beginning to fade. The vibrant pink of her skin was becoming lighter, and she could see through her own arms to the floor beneath. The humming reached a crescendo as the shadow figures closed in around her. Peppa felt herself becoming lighter, as if she was dissolving into the air itself. Her last coherent thought was wondering if this was how all the others had felt when their turn came. The next morning, the house stood empty and silent. The furniture remained in place. The toys were scattered exactly where they had been left, but there was no sign that anyone had ever lived there. Only the shadows on the walls seemed different, moving in ways that shadows shouldn't move, as if they contained something that had once been much more than darkness. Visitors to the house would later report feeling watched, hearing faint humming sounds, and seeing glimpses of pink figures in their peripheral vision. But whenever they turned to look directly, there was nothing there except shadows that seemed just a little too deep, a little too alive. The episode ends with the camera slowly panning across the empty rooms, while the
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. The day started like any other at Peppa's playgroup, but something was terribly wrong from the very beginning. When Peppa arrived at the classroom, she noticed that all the other children were sitting perfectly still in their chairs, facing forward with their hands folded neatly on their desks. Nobody was talking, nobody was playing, and nobody even turned to look when she walked in. Madame Gazelle stood at the front of the classroom with her back to the children, writing something on the blackboard that Peppa couldn't quite make out. The writing seemed to move and shift whenever she tried to focus on it, like it was written in a language that her eyes couldn't properly see. When Madame Gazelle finally turned around, her usual warm smile had been replaced by something that stretched far too wide across her face, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to go on forever. Pedro Pony was the first to turn his head toward Peppa, but when he did, she saw that his eyes had been replaced by two perfect black circles that seemed to absorb all the light around them. One by one, the other children began to turn their heads in the same mechanical way, each revealing the same empty black voids where their eyes should have been. Their mouths all opened at exactly the same time, and they began to speak in perfect unison, their voices creating a horrible harmony that made Peppa's skin crawl. They were reciting something that sounded like a nursery rhyme, but the words were all wrong. Instead of the cheerful songs they usually sang, they chanted about dark places where lost children go, about shadows that follow you home, and about games that never end once you start playing them. The rhythm was hypnotic and terrifying, and Peppa found herself wanting to join in even though every instinct told her to run. The classroom itself began to change as the chanting continued. The bright, colorful walls started to fade to a sickly gray color, and the cheerful drawings and posters began to peel away like old skin. The windows, which should have shown the sunny playground outside, now revealed only an endless black void that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. The toys and books scattered around the room began to move on their own, arranging themselves into strange patterns that hurt to look at directly. Peppa tried to back toward the door, but when she turned around, she discovered that the door had vanished completely. Where it should have been, there was now just another wall covered in the same peeling gray paint. She was trapped in this nightmare classroom with her transformed friends and their terrifying teacher, and there was no way out. Madame Gazelle began to approach Peppa with that impossible smile still stretching across her face. With each step she took, she seemed to grow taller and thinner, her limbs stretching like rubber until she looked more like a spider than a person. Her voice, when she finally spoke, came from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where the sound was actually coming from. She told Peppa that it was time for a very special lesson, one that would teach her about the true nature of friendship and belonging. The other children stopped their chanting and began to stand up from their chairs, moving in the same jerky, unnatural way. They formed a circle around Peppa, their black eyes never blinking, their mouths still curved in those horrible smiles that mirrored their teachers. The lesson, Madame Gazelle explained, was about becoming part of something bigger than yourself. It was about letting go of the things that made you different and embracing the beautiful uniformity that would make everyone the same. As she spoke, Peppa began to feel a strange tingling sensation in her eyes, and when she looked down at her reflection in a puddle that had mysteriously appeared on the floor, she saw that her own eyes were beginning to darken around the edges. The transformation was starting, and Peppa realized with growing horror that soon she would be just like all the others. She would sit in her chair with perfect posture, chant the dark nursery rhymes, and wait for the next new student to arrive so that the lesson could begin all over again. The playgroup would continue forever, with new children joining their ranks one by one, until everyone in the world had learned the same terrible lesson about belonging.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Peppa discovered something peculiar about her bedroom mirror. The reflection seemed to move a split second after she did. When she waved her hand, the reflection waved back with a slight delay, as if learning to copy her movements. George noticed it too during bedtime. His reflection held a different toy dinosaur with sharper teeth and glowing red eyes. The children tried to tell Mummy and Daddy Pig, but the adults couldn't see anything unusual. To them, the mirrors looked perfectly normal. As days passed, the reflections became bolder. Peppa's mirror self would smile when Peppa was sad, and frown when Peppa was happy. Late at night, she could hear faint giggling from behind the glass, even when she wasn't in the room. The sound was like her own laughter, but hollow and echoing. One morning, Peppa woke to find muddy hoofprints leading from her mirror to the window, though she had gone to bed with clean feet. The prints were her exact size, but glowed with faint, eerie light that disappeared when she tried to show her family. During breakfast, Mummy Pig mentioned that neighbors had been asking about Peppa playing in their garden at night, but Peppa had been asleep. The description matched perfectly. A little pig in a red dress, jumping in muddy puddles under moonlight, laughing that same hollow laugh. That evening, Peppa stayed awake to watch her mirror. As the clock struck midnight, her reflection stepped forward, pressing hands against the glass from inside. The mirror began to ripple like water, and slowly, the other Peppa began pushing through. The reflection spoke in Peppa's voice, but the words felt wrong. It said it had been watching, learning, and now wanted to play outside while the real Peppa stayed trapped behind the glass. The mirror world was lonely, with only backwards versions of everything she loved. As the other Peppa emerged from the mirror, the real Peppa felt invisible force pulling her toward the glass. She could see her bedroom becoming reversed, everything appearing backwards. Toys were arranged in mirror image, and even the moon seemed on the wrong side of the sky. George's reflection had also begun moving, reaching out to help pull Peppa into the mirror world. Their parents' reflections stood in the doorway, but their smiles were too wide, stretching across faces in ways that didn't look right. Peppa realized that in the mirror world, everything would be opposite. The reflection promised they would have fun together, playing games in reverse, where jumping in puddles made them dirty instead of clean. As Peppa's hand touched the mirror's surface, she felt cold glass giving way like thick liquid, calling her to a world where nothing was quite as it should be.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the window, and everything seemed normal. Mummy Pig called them down for breakfast, her voice echoing strangely through the house. As they walked down the stairs, Peppa noticed something odd about the family photos on the wall. The faces in the pictures seemed to be watching them, following their every movement with unblinking eyes. In the kitchen, Daddy Pig was sitting at the table reading his newspaper, but when he looked up to greet them, his smile was too wide, stretching impossibly across his face. His eyes had turned completely black, like deep holes in his head. Mummy Pig served them breakfast with jerky, mechanical movements, her head tilting at unnatural angles as she moved around the kitchen. George started crying, but instead of his usual tears, thick black liquid poured from his eyes. Peppa tried to comfort him, but when she touched his shoulder, her hand passed right through him as if he were made of mist. The kitchen began to grow darker, even though the sun was still shining outside. The shadows on the walls started moving on their own, creeping closer to the children. Suddenly, all the toys in the house came to life. Teddy bears with razor-sharp teeth crawled down from the shelves, their button eyes glowing red in the dim light. The toy dinosaur that George loved so much grew to enormous size, its plastic jaws snapping hungrily as it stomped through the living room, leaving deep cracks in the floor with each step. Peppa grabbed George's hand and they ran upstairs, but the house seemed to stretch endlessly. The hallway grew longer and longer, with doors appearing and disappearing along the walls. Behind each door, they could hear whispers calling their names in voices that sounded almost like their friends, but wrong somehow, distorted and hollow. They finally reached their bedroom and slammed the door shut, but when they turned around, the room had changed completely. The walls were covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse and writhe like living things. Their beds had transformed into gaping mouths with rows of sharp teeth, breathing heavily and waiting to swallow them whole. Outside their window, instead of their familiar garden, there was an endless void filled with floating eyes that blinked in unison. The eyes belonged to all their friends from playgroup, but their faces were twisted into expressions of pure terror. Susie Sheep's wool had turned black as coal, and her eyes had become empty sockets that seemed to stare directly into their souls. The children huddled together in the corner as the room began to spin around them. The furniture melted like wax, dripping onto the floor and forming puddles that reflected images of their worst nightmares. In the mirrors, they could see themselves, but their reflections were smiling even though they were terrified, and their reflection selves began to move independently, reaching out from the glass as if trying to pull them in. As the nightmare reached its peak, everything suddenly stopped. The room returned to normal, the sun was shining, and Mummy Pig was calling them for breakfast again. But when Peppa looked at George, she noticed that his reflection in the window was still smiling that terrible smile, even though George himself looked perfectly normal. And in the corner of her eye, she could swear she saw one of the toys move just slightly, as if it were still watching and waiting for the right moment to come alive again.